For nearly 25 years in Washington, one senator stood out for something that had nothing to do with policy. He was never seen with a wife on his arm, never introduced a fiancée at a state dinner, and never explained himself beyond a joke. Then, within days of his sudden passing at 71, the silence broke. His only sibling, the sister he raised almost single-handedly, finally told the world the real reason Lindsey Graham never married. It is a story far more moving than anyone expected, and it begins decades before he ever set foot in the Senate. A childhood behind the bar in Central, South Carolina. Lindsey Olin Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in the small town of Central, South Carolina, a blue-collar community where his parents, Millie and Florence James Graham, ran a restaurant, bar, pool hall, and liquor store known locally as the Sanitary Cafe. That business and the modest rooms behind it where the family actually lived forms the earliest chapter of a life that eventually led him all the way to the United States Senate, and it is a chapter that shaped nearly every decision that followed. The family eventually moved into a small house next door once the business found steadier footing, but Graham spent much of his boyhood working alongside his parents in the bar itself, absorbing the habits of small-town Southern life long before anyone imagined him sitting on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was the first person in his family to attend college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina with an ordinary set of plans that had nothing to do with national politics. Those plans were interrupted almost immediately by tragedy. In 1976, when Graham was 20 years old and his younger sister Darlene was only 11, their mother died of Hodgkin lymphoma, and 15 months later their father died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving both siblings without either parent before Graham had even finished his undergraduate degree. There was no wealthy relative waiting to step in and no extended family structure ready to absorb a grieving 11-year-old. There was only a young man barely out of his teens and a little sister who now depended entirely on him. That single fact, more than any campaign slogan or committee assignment that followed, quietly shaped every decision Graham would go on to make about his own personal life for the rest of his years. It also pushed him toward a profession built on structure and discipline. And after finishing his undergraduate studies, he enrolled in law school at the same university, setting himself on a path that would soon merge with a lifetime of military service. Friends who knew him during those years have often said that the loss forced him to grow up almost overnight, trading the ordinary concerns of a college student for the responsibilities of a guardian. He carried that same sense of duty into every job he held afterward, whether behind a bar counter as a teenager or, later, behind a lawyer's desk while still grieving two parents lost within little more than a year of each other. It is a detail that rarely appears in the headlines about his Senate career, yet it explains almost everything that came after. Becoming a father figure at 21. Rather than send Darlene to live with distant relatives, Graham made the extraordinary decision to keep her with him and raise her himself. After enrolling in the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps and beginning active duty in 1982, he legally adopted his own sister so that she could be covered under his military health and family benefits. His sister has since described him as someone who simply became her parent from that point forward, a role she says neither of them ever questioned once it began, and that description sits at the heart of everything that followed in both their lives. Balancing a demanding legal career in uniform with the responsibilities of raising a teenager who had just lost both her parents was not a symbolic gesture. Graham was, by his sister's own account, present for the ordinary and exhausting parts of parenting, from school troubles to the slow process of grief, all while finishing his law degree and building the foundation of a military legal career that would eventually stretch across 33 years. During the final 4 years of his active duty service, he was stationed at Rhein-Main Air Base in Germany, working as a military prosecutor and defense attorney far from the small South Carolina town where his sister was growing up, which made the logistics of raising her from overseas an added layer of difficulty that rarely makes it into political profiles of his career. He often returned home on leave to check in on her schooling and well-being, relying on a small circle of family friends in Central to help fill the gaps whenever his military duties pulled him overseas for extended stretches. Those same friends have said in later interviews that Darlene never seemed to lack for structure or attention, crediting Graham's insistence on staying involved even from a distance. It was, by most accounts, an unusual arrangement for a man barely out of his 20s, one that left very little room in his life for the kind of dating and courtship most people his age were pursuing at the time. The bond between them remained just as central decades later, when the two stopped together at their parents' graves on the way to his 2016 presidential campaign announcement in the same small town street where he grew up, a quiet ritual that ate more about his priorities than any speech delivered afterward. The night before that announcement, Darlene reportedly walked into the old pool room above their childhood home for the first time in roughly 3 decades, a moment that friends said left her visibly emotional as she confronted memories of the parents she lost as a child. It is this exact period that Darlene eventually pointed to when the public finally got its clearest answer to a question that had followed her brother for nearly 50 years. She has explained that he simply did not marry because he was consumed with the task of raising her, describing him as a young man taking on a young girl and teenager to raise while trying to finish school himself, language that left little ambiguity about where his priorities sat during the years most people spend building a household of their own. Darlene, now married with children of her own, according to family photographs she has shared publicly, has lived in South Carolina for most of her adult life, close to the town where her brother first took on the responsibility of raising her. Washington McCain, in a bachelor life in the spotlight. With his sister raised and his active duty service behind him, Graham entered elected politics in earnest, working first as an assistant attorney for Oconee County and then as city attorney for his own hometown of Central before winning a seat in the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1992. His path from those local legal roles to a member of the Senate Judiciary and Armed Services Committees ran alongside 33 years of total Air Force service, including his years as a prosecutor stationed in Germany, before he retired from the Reserve in 2015, a career arc that placed him at the center of national security debates for 2 decades. He moved to the United States House of Representatives in 1994 and then to the Senate in 2002, succeeding the long-serving Strom Thurmond, before winning re-election in both 2008 and 2014. Much of his reputation in Washington was built alongside his close friend Senator John McCain of Arizona. The two men, along with Senator Joe Lieberman, became known around the Capitol as the Three Amigos for their bipartisan work on defense and foreign policy. McCain once told an interviewer that he had seen Graham date plenty of attractive women over the years, but had never once seen him get seriously close to marriage, a line delivered with the same affection McCain showed toward the rest of Graham's personal quirks, and it became something of a running joke between the two men whenever reporters brought up the subject. When McCain was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2017, it was Graham who broke the news to fellow senators after speaking with him by phone, telling reporters afterward that the disease had never faced a tougher opponent. That friendship endured even after McCain's death in 2018, when Graham helped arrange for Ivanka Trump to attend the funeral despite the tension between her father and the McCain family, a gesture that reportedly required Graham to seek permission directly from McCain's widow. Graham's legislative record during these years reflected the same willingness to work across the aisle that defined his close friendship with John McCain. At a time when Washington was becoming increasingly polarized, Graham often positioned himself as someone willing to negotiate with political opponents if he believed it could produce meaningful legislation. That approach earned him both admiration and criticism. To supporters, he represented the kind of pragmatic lawmaker who prioritized governing over partisan talking points. To many critics within his own party, however, compromise too often looked like surrender. Nowhere was that tension more visible than on immigration reform. Beginning in the mid-2000s, Graham joined forces with the late Senator Ted Kennedy, one of the Democratic Party's most influential liberal voices, to pursue comprehensive immigration reform. Their proposal attempted to address several issues simultaneously, strengthening border security while modernizing the legal immigration system and creating a pathway to legal status for many undocumented immigrants already living in the United States under strict conditions. It was an ambitious proposal that sought to solve a decades-old political challenge rather than simply delay it. Although the legislation generated significant national debate, it also exposed Graham to fierce criticism from many conservative activists. They argued that any pathway allowing undocumented immigrants to remain in the country amounted to amnesty, regardless of the legal requirements attached. Graham rejected that characterization, insisting that effective immigration policy required balancing compassion with law enforcement. In his view, securing America's borders and an orderly legal immigration system were goals that should complement one another rather than compete. The issue did not disappear. Several years later, Graham again became one of the central Republican architects behind the bipartisan immigration bill introduced in 2013. As a member of the Senate's bipartisan Gang of Eight, he spent months negotiating with Democrats and fellow Republicans in an effort to craft legislation capable of attracting support from both parties. The resulting bill included billions of dollars for enhanced border security, reforms to visa programs, new employment verification requirements, and a lengthy pathway toward legal status and eventual citizenship for qualifying undocumented immigrants. The Senate ultimately passed the legislation with bipartisan support, but it stalled in the House of Representatives and never became law. Even so, Graham's involvement further cemented his reputation as one of the Republican Party's most visible advocates for immigration reform. Drawing upon his own military background as an Air Force lawyer and reserve officer, Graham consistently advocated for a strong American military and an assertive foreign policy. He became known as one of the Senate's most reliable national security hawks, frequently arguing that American leadership abroad remained essential for global stability. Rather than relying solely on intelligence briefings in Washington, Graham regularly traveled overseas to witness international events firsthand. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, he made repeated visits to meet with American military personnel, diplomats, and allied leaders. Those trips gave him firsthand exposure to the challenges facing U.S. forces and informed many of his public statements back in Washington. His travel continued long after those conflicts faded from the headlines. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine reshaped global politics, Graham emerged as one of the strongest congressional supporters of continued American assistance to Ukraine. He visited the country multiple times, meeting directly with government officials and expressing support for Ukraine's efforts to defend itself. Throughout those visits, he argued that assisting Ukraine was not simply an act of charity, but a strategic investment in international security and democratic stability. Whether discussing terrorism, NATO, China, Russia, or Middle Eastern conflicts, Graham consistently projected an interventionist foreign policy philosophy rooted in deterrence, military readiness, and strong international alliances. Supporters praised his consistency and experience, while critics questioned whether he too readily supported military involvement overseas. Regardless of perspective, his positions remained remarkably consistent over the course of his Senate career. While his legislative work frequently dominated headlines, Graham never entirely escaped public curiosity about his personal life. Unlike many presidential candidates before him, Graham had never married and had no children. That fact often generated questions from journalists, political commentators, and voters who wondered how an unmarried president might approach the ceremonial aspects of the office. During his brief campaign for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination, those questions surfaced repeatedly. One of the most common involved who would serve as First Lady if he were elected president. Rather than becoming defensive, Graham answered with humor. Instead, Graham devoted most of his adult life to public service, military commitments, and politics. Whether admired for his independence or criticized for his unpredictability, he remained one of the Senate's most recognizable figures, someone whose career was shaped as much by his willingness to challenge expectations as by the policies he championed. His political identity went through a dramatic transformation during this same broader period. He was among Donald Trump's sharpest Republican critics during the 2016 primary season, at one point calling him a race-baiting bigot after Trump proposed banning Muslims from entering the country, a moment that led Trump to publicly reveal Graham's personal cell phone number at a campaign rally. In the years following John McCain's Death in 2018. Graham gradually became one of Trump's most influential Republican allies in the Senate, a political shift that reshaped his public identity almost as thoroughly as his private family story had shaped his personal one. He went on to chair the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021, playing a central role in confirming a long line of federal judges, and later chaired the Senate Budget Committee from 2025 until his death, remaining a fixture of American foreign policy debates until his final days in office. Darlene Graham, Nordun, finally explains the choice behind it all. Senator Lindsey Graham died on July 11, 2026, at the age of 71, following what his office initially described as a brief and sudden illness. A preliminary medical examination later pointed to a torn aorta connected to hardened arteries as the likely cause, a condition that could develop silently for years before turning fatal without warning, which made the timing of his death especially jarring given that he had recently returned from an overseas trip and had a high-profile media appearance scheduled for that very week. Tributes poured in from across the political spectrum within hours. Meghan McCain, daughter of Graham's late friend, wrote a personal remembrance describing him as someone she and her family had come to think of as an extension of their own, recalling how he remained close to them for years after her father's death in 2018, continuing to visit and call long after the cameras and political obligations had faded away. Members of the McCain family echoed that same sense of personal loss, with some describing their heartbreak at losing a man they had considered part of their own household for nearly 3 decades. Other tributes noted that Graham died as the only sitting member of the Senate who had never married, a fact that had followed him through his entire time in Washington, and that took on new meaning once his sister began speaking publicly about why. Amid that flood of official statements, it was Darlene Graham Nordun who offered the most personal account of who her brother truly was. Now a mother of 2 who works helping people with disabilities find employment, she has described her brother's decision to raise her as something he treated as more important than building a family of his own. She has said that Lindsey told her early on that he would take care of her, and that he simply followed through on that promise for the rest of his life without ever treating it as a burden, a promise that outlasted every joke he ever made about his own bachelorhood. His official obituary reiterated that he was only in his early 20s when both of his parents died within 15 months of each other, leaving him to raise his younger sister while still completing his own education, a summary that traced his path from that personal tragedy through law school, military service, and decades in elected office. In a fitting